before she married a Vanderbilt and became the queen of the Gilded Age. She was just Alva Smith, born before the Civil War, into a Southern family that would lose everything. Her mother was cast out of society. Her fortune disappeared. But Alva Smith wanted to rule, and she would. She clawed her way up New York's marble staircases, married into America's richest family, built palaces of limestone and gold, and forced Mrs. Astor to kneel. She didn't just enter high society, she overthrew it. But her greatest empire wasn't marble, it was her daughter. She raised her to marry the Duke of Marlborough, cousin to Winston Churchill. But when that daughter begged to follow her heart, Alva replied, "I do not ask you to think. I demand you to obey." She orchestrated a royal wedding and broke her daughter to do it. Then, when her husband took lovers, she did the unthinkable. She divorced him, scandalized society, and walked away from the world she had conquered. But Alva didn't fade. She turned her money, her fury, and her will toward something greater: votes for women. She paid for pickets, printing presses, and bail. She stood at the back of marches she had funded, no speeches, no fanfare, just banners, bruises, and the quiet strength of a woman trying to buy back what she had once taken away. This is not a fairy tale. This is not a redemption arc. This is the ruthless, riveting, and deeply human story of Alva Vanderbilt. Not a legend, but a legacy carved in iron. If you like stories like this, please consider joining the channel. We have over 80 women's biographies on the channel, with more coming every week. Let us know who you would like us to cover as well. Now let's get into the story of the ruthless rise of Alva Vanderbilt. She was born into heat and silence on the 17th of January, 1853, in the cotton port of Mobile, Alabama, where the air was thick with jasmine and judgment. Almost immediately, she began defying the life set out for her. They named her Alva. She was the seventh of 9 children. Only 5 survived. Her mother would later call her impossible. Alva wore the word like armor, sharp, shining, fitted to her skin. Her world began in a grand white house on the corner of Government and Conception Streets. Crenellated roofs, high casement windows, a marble-floored bathhouse tucked behind the magnolias. It wasn't just a home, it was a fortress of hierarchy. And inside, a girl learned early. You either dominated or you were dominated. Her mother, Phoebe, had tried to rule Mobile. She came from Kentucky planter aristocracy, commanding, exacting, convinced the city would bow to her charm. It didn't, and the city's doors stayed shut. One winter, a satirical pamphlet circulated in Mobile society. Thinly veiled, elegantly cruel, it mocked Phoebe, who hosted suppers no one attended, and spoke of lineage no one cared to hear. Phoebe folded in fury. She declared the town unworthy of conquest and raised her daughter to conquer larger things. The Smiths had earned their money on the backs of slaves. Alva's mother had received enslaved people as a wedding gift. When the family later fled north, they brought them along, renamed servants, but changed in name only. One of them, Monroe Crawford, was assigned to Alva. She adored him, and she ruled him. "I bossed him," she would say later. "It was a case of absolute control on my part." She loved him the way a mirror loves light, not for who he was, but for what he gave back, a reflection of her will. He brushed her shoes, held her parasol, carried her silence. He never defied her, never interrupted, and above all, never questioned her. Even as a child, she discovered the pleasure of command. A world that refused to see girls like her, she would make it see. Her favorite toys were dolls, but they were not mere playthings, they were her subjects. She dressed them in French lace, laid them in narrow beds. They were hungry, or tired, or cold, she could tell by looking. She read their silences like scripture. She paced at night to tuck them in again. They had to lie flat. No doll should sleep sitting up, she told her sisters. They dream badly when they do. She wasn't playing, she was practicing. In that house, dominance was taught by repetition, over siblings, over servants, over softness. Alva learned quickly, and she never unlearned it. Phoebe came from Kentucky planter aristocracy, proud and imperious. She demanded obedience. Alva gave her defiance. When a governess tried to withhold her own room, Alva smashed every ornament in the nursery. When a boy mocked her for being a girl, she struck him with fists and teeth. "I gave blow for blow," she said. At 13, she once choked and stomped a boy until strangers had to pull her off. "I'll show you what girls can do," she screamed. He had been a guest of the Isnagas. She wasn't interested in becoming a young lady. She was interested in becoming a force. But beneath the fury lived something quieter, a child's grief, unspoken and unresolved. In 1857, when Alva was 4, her older brother Murray Jr. died at 13. He was the father's namesake, the heir, the golden child. Alva watched the house fill with silence and veiled glances, how Phoebe would never recover, how Murray Sr. would never be the same. "No one can replace him," they whispered. Not even the daughters still living. Alva remembered that moment not with sorrow, but rage. A dead son was worth more than a living daughter. From that day forward, she stopped seeking affection. She began demanding recognition. She didn't yet understand power, but she understood absence. She had seen what it meant to be overlooked, and she decided silence would never be part of her life again. Even the house that held her, the white-columned mansion in Mobile, became a kind of ghost. After they left Alabama, she spent decades trying to rebuild it in stone, in Newport, in Manhattan, in her dreams of French chateaux. "Always these houses," she wrote, "real and imaginary, reproduced certain features of the home in which I was born. High ceilings, marble floors, wide halls that opened onto gardens, and maybe, too, the ghost of a girl who had once sworn never to be invisible again." Then came the war, and everything changed. When the Civil War broke out, the Smiths fled north, exchanging one system of power for another. They brought their enslaved staff with them, renamed as servants, but changed in name only. The voyage was long. They crossed on a paddle steamer in midwinter. Phoebe insisted on taking her daughters, a pair of maids, a lapdog with matted ears, and a mockingbird, sickly and shaking in a brass cage. Phoebe would not travel without style. Alva never forgot the sound the bird made when the wind pushed in through the seams. In New York, they were met with cold stares and locked doors. At church, their southern accents drew silence. The rector at the Church of the Ascension preached abolition from the pulpit. Phoebe stood without blinking. Afterward, they left, never returned. When Lincoln was assassinated, they draped black bombazine across the windows, not in mourning, but to shield the glass from northern stones. Even inside their own home, there was the sense of something narrowing. The halls were quieter, the invitations fewer. Phoebe's name, once spoken like promise, was now a question. Eventually, they sold the Fifth Avenue house. Alva watched the shutters close and thought, nothing is permanent, not even marble. And so they sailed for Europe. But Mobile came with her, in dreams, in shadows, in shape. The girl who crossed the Atlantic in 1866 was only 13, but she already understood the rules she would live by. Obedience meant nothing. Control meant everything. And even as she sailed toward empire, etiquette, and eligible sons, she carried the lessons of a newer world. The power of appearances, the art of dominance, and the unbearable cost of being born a daughter. She would build palaces. She would marry a Vanderbilt. She would force the world to take her seriously. But nothing she built, not the mansions, not the scandals, not even her fury, would ever be separate from that first house, that first inheritance. That whispered truth in southern heat, if no one will give you power, take it. She arrived in Paris like a storm disguised as a schoolgirl, 13 years old, newly dislodged from every route she had ever known. Phoebe told them they would rent a flat on the Champs-Élysées. But Alva understood. This was not a holiday. They weren't just leaving a house. They were escaping disgrace. Paris welcomed them, or at least it looked away politely. The court of Napoleon III and Empress Eugenie was at its peak, perfumed, polished, and exquisitely removed. The Civil War meant nothing here. The Smith name meant nothing. Southern Americans weren't condemned. They were curious. Phoebe charmed the minister de la Marine. She dressed Armide in ivory, draped her in pearls, and presented her into society like a letter of introduction. Armide danced with minor nobility and Belgian cousins. Alva watched from the balcony. She was too young for the ballroom, but not for the strategy. She stood behind velvet drapes and studied the court the way a general studies terrain. One night, they were invited to a masquerade hosted by the minister himself. It was spectacle, pure theater. A camel entered bearing Asia. Crocodiles snapped for Africa. America came last. A pale girl in a hammock carried by costumed black men beneath banana leaves, escorted by painted squaws and draped in bunting. 3,000 guests watched the continents parade beneath chandeliers. Alva said nothing, but she remembered everything. And for the first time, Alva stood in a world where beauty did not soften power. It was power. She watched as her older sister was presented into society, offered like a calling card to minor nobility and diplomats. Phoebe flirted with the Minister of the Navy, and Alva, too young for the ballroom, watched it all from the ministry's balconies, gilt braid, velvet drapery, polished marble. She memorized the angle of a curtsy, the tilt of a fan, the weight of attention. Parisian society was illusion made flesh. Titles were bought, fortunes repainted. Identities could be invented with a smile or a surname. American girls became marquises if they curtsied at the right moment. Alva didn't watch like a dreamer. She watched like a strategist. What Mobile had taught through whippings, Paris revealed in velvet. Control was possible if you understood the game. She fell in love with France, with its symmetry, its restraint, its deliberate excess. She read French history, memorized dynasties, sketched chateaux in the margins of her school books. Turrets, staircases, balustrades traced from memory. Versailles became her cathedral. The Château de Blois, her secret. She dragged governesses through the Loire Valley, pointing out cornices and spires like other girls pointed out dresses. She sketched, not to pass time, to possess it, to keep it. She didn't want to visit beauty, she wanted to own it. In New York, she had rebelled against every lesson. French education was different. It had rules, it had hierarchy, it had clarity. She wrote later that she could not learn from impersonal pages, but France had given her something personal, consequence. When she begged to be sent to school, Phoebe agreed. She enrolled at Mademoiselle Coulon's, a strict boarding school outside the city walls. The daughters of diplomats, dukes, and distant sugar fortunes filled the dormitories. Alva lasted just under a year. She remained what she had always been, impossible. She climbed trees, refused lessons, dismantled decorum like a clock, gear by gear. When bored by etiquette instruction, she arrived with her hair unpinned, dark waves falling across her shoulders like defiance made visible. She once rewrote a classmate's essay on Mary, Queen of Scots. In this version, the Queen drowned before ever reaching Scotland. The girl cried. Alva shrugged. Still, school suited her more than anything had before. For a child raised on dominance and improvisation, this was the first system she did not want to overthrow, but to master. In 1867, the world came to Paris. The Exposition Universelle opened like a mechanical opera, gaslight shimmering against iron, nations parading their splendor in glass and steel. Beneath the Eiffel Dome, modernity strutted on display. Steam engines, moving sidewalks, electric marvels. Edison's inventions gleamed with the promise of empires not yet built. From a balcony draped in brocade, Alva watched soldiers march for kings and crowds cheer for emperors. She felt no awe. She felt recognition. This spectacle of order and invention, was not a world she wished to admire. It was a world she intended to shape. But even cathedrals of steel cannot stop decline. By 1869, the Smith fortune had thinned to whispers. Phoebe was ill. The family was shrinking. The lodgings grew smaller, the invitations fewer. And then the worst came. Her father announced they would return to America. Alva was devastated. She had grown into Paris like ivy around stone. Versailles, the silver-lit boulevards, the scent of horses and perfume in the dusk, this was where she had first recognized herself. America, she would later say, felt raw. France was finished, but the Smiths were going back. The path toward a Vanderbilt marriage had not yet begun, but it would. The girl who had once been raised among cotton and punishment now returned carrying something else. Blueprints in her mind, architecture in her blood, and Versailles beneath her skin. She would never be the same. and no house she ever built again would stand without France carved into its bones. She returned to New York in 1869, 16 years old, and newly divided from the place she had come to love. Paris had trained her eye. It had shaped her habits. She had learned to sketch staircases and curtsy to princes, to read buildings like language, to expect the world to move in rhythm and restraint. But New York had changed. It was louder now, cruder. The war had loosened everything: manners, morals, meaning. She watched a man spit onto the steps of Grace Church. She saw a woman in velvet laugh as her poodle snapped at a one-legged soldier. She thought it vulgar. And worse, she saw that her family no longer belonged. Murray Smith, once a respected cotton agent, was now a relic in a world remade. Railroads ruled trade, stocks ruled men, and fortune no longer followed the polite. The Smiths moved from 5th Avenue to 33rd Street, then to 44th. Each house smaller, each carpet more worn. The servants slowly disappeared. Phoebe unpacked their things herself now. The boxes from Paris still arrived twice a year. Alva watched her mother lift out dresses sewn in France, delicate, scented, folded with reverence. The clothes still looked like power, but the invitations had stopped coming. No one said the word ruin, but everyone knew what it smelled like. Then in 1871, Phoebe died. Inflammatory rheumatism. She was 48. Alva was 18. They had not always agreed, but Phoebe had understood her. The force, the flair, the need for more. At her mother's coffin, Alva made a silent vow. She would become the kind of woman her mother had imagined into being. She would not want me to stop here, she told herself. Desha, her brother, had never felt loved and disappeared into his own life. He left quietly. No letter, no reason. To Murray, he was the wrong kind of son, the kind who left. Her sisters were sweet, passive, uncertain. But Alva saw the storm coming. There was no money, no connections, only debts, whispers, and the distant possibility of disgrace. Her father grew pale. He whispered they might have to open a boarding house. The others looked down. Alva said, "If we do, I'll do the scrubbing." But scrubbing was not her plan. She had watched her father's hands tremble over the unpaid butcher's bill. She had walked past shop windows and seen her mother's gowns in the discount glass. She would save them. Not with tears, with strategy. In a world where women had no tools but beauty and marriage, she would master both. She did not wait for invitations. She entered society through the side door, with younger names and older friends. Minnie Stevens, Jessie Duncan, Consuelo Yiznaga. They weren't inside Mrs. Astor's fabled 400, but they moved like stars in a looser constellation. Girls who knew how to dress, how to laugh, how to be seen. Some were old blood, others, like Minnie Stevens, daughter of a hotel magnate, were whispered about. Her mother was said to have been a chambermaid. Consuelo's family had Cuban plantations and rumors of too many parties. Mrs. Astor preferred her guests pale and Protestant. These girls were neither. But they had style, and more importantly, they had each other. And it was through Consuelo that she met William Kissam Vanderbilt. Willie K was soft-spoken, confident, beautifully dressed. Like Alva, he had been educated in Europe. Like her, he preferred horses to crowds and spoke fluent French. But unlike her, he carried a name that clanged with new money. The Vanderbilts were wealthier than kings, but to Mrs. Astor they were railroad men, not real ones. She once said of A.T. Stewart, another parvenu, "I buy my carpets from him, but that doesn't mean I invite him to walk on them." Alva didn't share that revulsion. She saw the name for what it was, a lifeline. They saw each other often, at dinners, at skating parties, beneath chandeliers and borrowed ceilings. He wasn't brilliant, but he was kind, and kind was enough. Still, she knew kindness wouldn't secure a marriage. Not in New York, not with her family slipping by the hour. She had seen the butcher's bill go unpaid. She had watched her father go silent over breakfast. She could feel the edge of the future narrowing, tight as a corset. She also knew what social survival cost now. You couldn't enter society with charm alone. You needed 20-course dinners, live orchestras in your parlor, gowns sewn in Paris, and gloves changed 3 times a night. Belonging had become a business, and she was running out of credit. In the summer of 1874, she traveled with friends to White Sulphur Springs, a quiet Virginia resort where Southern families still sent their daughters to marry well. Alva brought an old nurse with her and a plan. One afternoon, she walked to a village shop and bought yards of cheap black tarlatan, a stiff, transparent fabric. With her nurse's help, she spent the day sewing tiny bouquets of goldenrod across the bodice, yellow against black like sunlight after rain. That evening, as the guests dressed in silks and moirés, Alva slipped into the fields and gathered fresh goldenrod by hand. The ballroom shimmered with white dresses and candlelight. And then, Alva entered. 21. Resplendent in black and gold, her hair swept high, the fabric rustling like strategy made visible. The light caught the blossoms. She glowed. She did not flirt. She did not chatter. She stood still, luminous and composed. The room turned toward her, and William Kissam Vanderbilt, who had known her before, now saw her differently. She wasn't a girl anymore. She had written herself into the story. Whispers followed her after that night. Even Mrs. Astor took notice. By autumn, the engagement was formalized. Willie proposed. She accepted. There were no tears, no trembling refusals. She had won. On the morning of her wedding, in April 1875, Alva stood in her gown, ready to leave. Her father kissed her hand. He was too ill to walk her down the aisle. His skin was gray, his voice steadier than it should have been. "You're taking a great burden off my mind," he said. "I know now you'll look after the others." She nodded. She did not marry for love. She married to survive. And from that day forward, she would never be powerless again. On the wedding day, the pews were filled with orchids, velvet fans, and the faint rustle of silk gloves. Her gown, trimmed in antique lace, had been hastily replaced when the original failed to arrive from Paris. The guests were carefully chosen. The carriages waited in rows. The crowd outside pressed against barricades to glimpse the new Mrs. Vanderbilt. Alva had risen so far, so fast. From months ago, discussing working in a boarding house to one of the richest women in the world. Yet in New York, where Mrs. Astor reigned, she did not yet wear the crown. 2 weeks later, her father died. He had lived just long enough to see one of his daughters secure an empire. The rest, Alva understood, was up to her. She ordered mourning bands stitched into the sleeves of her new dresses. The lace at the collar was gray for 6 months, but her eyes stayed forward. Grief had no place in strategy. She moved into a brownstone on West 44th Street, a gift from William's father, William Henry Vanderbilt. He received her warmly and told her to come to him for anything. The Commodore, still alive and watching, said little. Alva tread carefully. She studied the family like a system. Their power was immense, but their taste was shapeless. The houses were hulking. The art was borrowed. The salons dripped with imitation. They had money, but not manner. Fortune, but no form. She saw what no one else dared to say aloud. The Vanderbilts were rich, yes, but carrying the aroma of new money. They bought castles, but not credibility. They were feared, but not followed. And in New York, that meant exclusion. At the summit of society stood Caroline Astor, Mrs. Astor, a woman with gloved hands and an iron will. Her parlor on Fifth Avenue was a throne room. Her visiting list, a ledger of legitimacy. To be seen by Mrs. Astor was to be real. To be omitted was to vanish. She had never called on the Vanderbilts. They were not on her list. And in a city where wealth required ancestry, where money without manners was still vulgar, Mrs. Astor guarded the gates. She did not care how many railroads you owned. She cared whether your name had been whispered in drawing rooms since the Revolution, whether your mother's silver had been passed down, not purchased, whether your wealth had the patina of time. And as New York's drawing rooms remained closed to her, Alva turned her attention to a more pliable realm, a smaller kingdom where she alone would rule, motherhood. On March 2nd, 1877, she gave birth to her first child, a daughter. She named her Consuelo, after Consuelo Yznaga, now Viscountess Mandeville. The name was not merely sentimental, it was strategic, a signal to the world and a promise to herself. This child would not orbit New York, waiting to be received. She would be launched into a higher world. It was not enough that Consuelo should be cherished. She would be chiseled From her cradle, she was cast as a vessel for everything Alva had been denied: recognition, reverence, aristocracy by marriage, if not by blood. Consuelo would wear a title, perhaps a coronet, perhaps a crown. What she would not wear was liberty. In time, Alva would become a fierce advocate for women's suffrage, standing at podiums, demanding the vote, challenging the very world that had once excluded her. But not yet. In these early years, democracy had no place in the nursery. Consuelo would never cast a vote in the decisions that shaped her life. Her path was already drawn. Motherhood to Alva was not instinct, it was architecture. She scheduled feedings like fittings, lessons like renovations. Each governess, each tutor, each hour of posture and French was a brick in the edifice of a future duchess. "I gave to them what I wished had been given to me," she would later say. But this was not only healing, this was blueprint. This was ambition swaddled in linen. This was dynasty in miniature. The dolls she had lined up in childhood, laid flat, dressed in lace, commanded like courtiers, were now made flesh, and hers to rule. Consuelo was not just a child, she was a citadel in the making. And Alva, her architect, her general, her mother, had already begun to build. That same year, the Commodore died. Willie inherited $3 million. With it came freedom. For Alva, it meant materials: stone, light, legacy. She would build not just a house, but a future. She sketched the first lines herself. When she showed them to William Henry Vanderbilt, he flinched at the cost. She smiled. "You'll find the money," she said. He laughed and signed the check. The first project was Idle Hour, a country estate on Long Island. The land rolled softly toward the bay. It was meant to soothe. But Alva had no interest in softness. Idle Hour taught her proportion. Her next house would declare power. There she met Richard Morris Hunt, Paris-trained, sharp-tempered, and the most celebrated architect in America. She respected him instantly, but she would not sit back. She would be involved in every aspect. She came in 3 times a week, gloves still on, sketches in hand. They argued, constantly, brilliantly. One day he shouted, "Damn it, Mrs. Vanderbilt, who is building this house?" She didn't blink. "Damn it, Mr. Hunt, who is going to live in it?" Idle Hour was not a retreat, it was a warm-up. Her true canvas was New York. She commissioned 660 Fifth Avenue, a limestone chateau with turrets and gargoyles, modeled on the Chateau de Blois. Hunt would build it, but the vision, every inch, was hers. It would not whisper taste, it would roar it. Not Newport imitation, Versailles and gaslight, a rebuke to Manhattan's brownstone hush. Her house would not blend, it would declare. The carvings shocked, cherubs, grotesques, naked children. A guest whispered, scandalized, "People are offended." Alva smiled. That too was by design. She had not risen through grief and refusal to be polite. She had risen to be seen. The interiors were theatrical. A staircase built to be watched. A banquet hall like a cathedral. Stained glass spilled light onto allegorical ceilings. French furniture, engraved silver. Every piece selected not to signal wealth, but command. This was not a home. It was a palace of intent. By 1882, it was nearly complete. Servants polished stone, drapers hung silk. The invitations had not yet been sent, but the list had been written. Carefully, mercilessly. And still, Mrs. Astor had not called. Alva had watched for the carriage, listened for the knock. But the silence held, and without a formal call, she could not be invited. That was the rule. But Alva no longer played by rules she hadn't written. She would not knock, she would not wait, she would summon. And so she planned a costume ball. Not a party, not an affair, but a pageant. A coronation in brocade, 1,000 guests, powdered footmen, marble staircases lit with gaslight, tapestries, orchids. Fountains of champagne, a fantasy brought to life in silk and silver. But the Astors were not on the list. Among the hopeful was Carrie Astor, Caroline's daughter. She had the gowns, the youth, the desire. But she lacked one thing, an invitation, because her mother had never called. And Alva, meticulous, unyielding, would not budge. To exclude Carrie would be to humiliate the Astors. To include her would require surrender. And so Alva waited, calm, certain. In the drawing room at 665th, she sat like a queen before the crown. And then at last, a carriage, a knock, a calling card. Mrs. Astor, the visit was paid. the social code observed, and the invitation, finally, extended. In a single gesture, New York's great gatekeeper had passed the key. Alva had not begged, she had not pleaded, she had built, and now she ruled. On the night of March 26, 1883, she held her costume ball at 660, a limestone palace built for this moment, her moment. There were 1,600 guests, 5 orchestras, rivers of champagne. The chandeliers blazed until dawn. The staircase was transformed into Olympus. Guests arrived as goddesses, monks, falcons, kings. The invitation had specified, arrive as a myth, a memory, or a marvel. It was not a party. It was a pageant. Reporters waited outside. Thousands lined the streets for a glimpse of the house and of the people walking into it. The New York Times printed spreads across multiple columns, costumes, jewels, allegory. They wrote about the ball as if it were a coronation, and in a way it was. Alva stood in a robe of Venetian silver, flanked by footmen in powdered wigs. She had once lined up dolls like courtiers. Now they curtsied back. The new Queen of New York had arrived. Not even Phoebe, with her maids and Mockingbird, had dreamed of this. But Alva was nowhere near finished. After the ball, nothing was the same. Her rooms were copied. Her guest list became scripture. Her taste was law. She had won. And yet, when the music faded, the silence inside the house began to grow. The furniture was perfect. The glass was spotless. The marble stairs reflected nothing but light. She filled the rooms with duchesses, diplomats, and kings, but rarely laughter. The house had been built to conquer, not to comfort. And the marriage, which had always been distant, began to crumble. Her husband drifted from her like steam from a teacup. Willie retreated into clubs, yachts, races, and quiet affairs. He avoided conflict. She avoided submission. They didn't quarrel. They simply lived beside each other. 2 well-dressed strangers in a cathedral of stone. Still, Alva kept constructing her world. In 1892, she began again. Marble House would be her second Versailles, built on a bluff above the Atlantic, with 500,000 cubic feet of imported stone, Corinthian columns, and a ballroom that echoed like a chapel. The walls were paneled in gold. The windows faced no one. It was the most lavish summer home in America, and the coldest. She walked the halls alone. Servants moved in silence. No music came from the drawing rooms unless she summoned it. When she wanted silence, the curtains were drawn and the lamps turned low. Visitors paused before speaking. It was as though the house itself had gone into shadow. She had built it to begin again, to start fresh, to outshine even herself. But nothing lived in the house that was not arranged. Nothing breathed that had not been measured. The press gasped, visitors marveled. But Alva no longer smiled in photographs. She moved through Marble House like a high priestess in her own religion, surrounded by gold, but never warmth. In 1894, the family sailed for Europe. It was meant to soothe things, to rest. But Alva and Willie stopped speaking somewhere in the Atlantic. He disappeared to the clubs in Paris. She remained on the ship, drinking tea, correcting architectural proofs, and walking the deck alone. Consuelo, now 17, ferried messages between them. Alva said nothing, but her gloves were never off. They returned to New York in silence. She walked into 665th, past the staircase she had designed, beneath the ceiling she had chosen, into the house she had used to win everything, and felt nothing. Once, she had thought marriage could be a foundation, something to build upon. But it had become just another structure, grand, hollow, and no longer worth preserving. By winter of 1894, the preparations had begun. No scandal, no shouting, no drama, just a woman stepping out of her own creation. In March 1895, New York society opened its papers and gasped. Alva Vanderbilt was divorcing her husband. No woman of her standing, with her money, her power, her marble palaces, had ever done it. Divorce was for the reckless, the ruined, the fading. Alva was none of those. She gave no explanation. She didn't need one. Willie had been careless. He had stopped hiding the affairs. Anne Harriman Sands Rutherford was the last and most visible, sleek, wealthy, and already infamous for outliving 2 husbands. She glided into carriages. She whispered in galleries. People talked. Alva listened. And then she moved. She didn't cry, she didn't rage, she hired the best attorneys in Manhattan and arranged the terms like a ledger. $10 million in cash. Marble House remained hers. Custody of the children, unquestioned. The marriage ended as it had begun, by Alva's design. He strayed in shadows. She stepped out in daylight. Society was scandalized. Mrs. Astor looked away. Drawing rooms whispered, but the press marveled. Alva wasn't ruined. She was radiant. And while most women would have vanished in disgrace, she appeared at the opera, chin high, gloves white, diamond clasp at the throat. She had delivered the name, the dynasty, the illusion. Now she would keep the house and the silence, not because it was expected, but because at last it was hers. With the marriage gone, she turned inward and then onto her daughter. Consuelo was 17, tall, luminous, fluent in French and expectation. She had fallen in love with Winthrop Rutherford, a man of good family but no title. He was everything Consuelo wanted, kind, clever, American, and everything Alva did not. Alva was incandescent. She called Consuelo ungrateful, a disappointment, a fool. "I didn't raise you to think," she told her. "I raised you to obey." When Consuelo refused to leave New York, Alva claimed illness. She wept. She took to bed. She told the girl she was dying and that her disobedience was killing her. Incense was burned. Clergy were called. The curtains were drawn. The servants dismissed. The house had once darkened itself in mourning. Now she darkened it by design. Each day, Consuelo came to her bedside. Each day, Alva said, "You're breaking my heart." Consuelo fought, but the house had been closed to Winthrop. No word from him could reach her. She was a prisoner in her own home, and when Alva's illness worsened, Consuelo wept and surrendered. She wrote to Winthrop, "I cannot see you again. I obey." And Alva began the next arrangement. She negotiated with the Duke of Marlborough, a distant cousin of Winston Churchill. He had a title, a debt-ridden estate, and a hunger for dowry. Alva had a daughter with posture and porcelain skin. They discussed bloodlines. They bartered settlements. Alva met with lawyers. She counted staircases at Blenheim Palace, designed the veil, and sent out the invitations. The once grand palace would be saved by Vanderbilt money, and Alva's daughter would bear a title. The wedding had to be perfect. All society would be watching. There were rehearsals. Alva ordered her to walk the aisle again and again, head high, steps light, eyes forward. She adjusted the veil, told her when to smile, when to cry, and when to stop. The night before the wedding, Consuelo wrote, "I feel like a prisoner in a play I cannot stop." On the wedding day, she wept behind the veil. It trailed behind her like a sentence. It was so long, it took 3 attendants to carry. The guest list stretched past 1,500. She had to be propped up before the ceremony. Her hands shook. Her eyes would not meet the mirror. Alva adjusted the veil again. She had delivered a duchess, but lost a daughter. She sent no letters in the days that followed. She had expected gratitude, but all she received was silence. Months later, in January 1896, Alva remarried. Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont on a cold January day in 1896. The press called it a love match. It wasn't. But it was, in every way that mattered to her, the right match. He was a widower, rich, well-bred. He had a fondness for horses and newspapers and never interrupted a woman who spoke with authority. That was enough. He admired her without needing to control her, and he left decisions to her by instinct. For Alva, whose first marriage had been one long war for legitimacy, this was peace, the kind she could shape. Oliver offered admiration, not orders. That was all she required. They moved into Belcourt Castle, his unfinished fantasy estate in Newport. It had been designed by Richard Morris Hunt, the same architect who had built her palaces, but in Oliver's hands it had become a Gothic bachelor's hallucination. Horses were stabled on the ground floor. The main hall was an armory of swords and stag heads. Every window was pointed like a weapon. Even the press noticed. The Newport papers called it eccentric. Privately, they called it absurd. Alva took one look and began again. She cleared the horses out. The blackened walnut was replaced with cream paneling. She mirrored the ballroom ceiling, softened the entryways, and converted the armory into a drawing room. Where there had once been lances, she hung tapestries. She had the chandeliers rewired and the fireplaces faced in Italian marble. Even the stable tiles were replaced. She didn't make the house beautiful. She made it hers. There were no nods to French chateau this time. No effort to impress Mrs. Astor. No anxious glances towards society's gaze. The lines were cleaner, the scale more theatrical. Belcourt wasn't a reflection. It was a declaration. This was not Blois. It was Belmont, and she ruled it alone. Their marriage was not warm, but it was easy. Oliver was often away, at the racetrack, the yacht, in New York for business or boredom. Alva didn't mind. When he was home, he followed her lead. He deferred to her judgment on menus, guest lists, room placement, window treatments. He never questioned her ambition. He never tried to shape her into anything she wasn't. He stayed out of her way, and he stayed. She began to withdraw from society life. There were no more grand Vanderbilt balls, no invitations that made the newspapers. Belcourt was not a stage. It was a realm of silence, ordered to her rhythm. She kept a small staff. She hosted dinners, not galas. Conversation replaced performance. She began inviting different kinds of people. A journalist here, a suffrage-minded widow there, an artist, a teacher. Slowly, the rooms changed. The mirrors reflected not jewels, but thought. She circled names in lecture programs. She subscribed to journals she once would have dismissed. She stopped listening for society's applause and started listening for something else. Something was shifting, not yet clearly, but quietly. In 1903, she sold the last of her Vanderbilt properties. Idle Hour was gone. Fifth Avenue, already irrelevant. She kept Marble House, but only because it was hers. Earned by endurance. She rarely stayed there long. It was always immaculate. But it felt more like a mausoleum than a home. The old rooms felt smaller now. There were days she walked Belcourt for hours without seeing a soul. She liked it that way. She read more, traveled less. And then, in 1908, Oliver died. The cause was appendicitis. It came quickly. He fell ill at their New York home and was gone within days. Alva was by his side. She did not faint. She did not weep in public. She arranged the funeral. She returned to Belcourt. She wore black, but never ceased hosting. Society waited for the widow to retreat. Instead, she restructured. There was no performance of grief, because Oliver had never required performance. She had been herself in that marriage entirely. And now she would be herself in widowhood, with no one left to answer to. She did not remarry. She did not rejoin society as a grand widow. She did not flirt or host for display. The estate was hers. The name was hers. The staff reported to her and her alone. No husband, no mother-in-law, no rivals. For the first time, Alva Belmont lived without friction. She had space. She had silence. She had the house and the voice, all to herself. And this time, she would build something no one could take away. By 1908, the suffrage movement was gaining force in New York. Women marched in long coats and ruined boots. Their banners were sewn by hand, their voices hoarse by evening. Newspapers printed grainy photographs, arrests on Fifth Avenue, bruises from baton strikes, corseted women in feathered hats standing shoulder to shoulder against policemen. A girl with a swollen eye, another holding a placard, "I am not property." Salons no longer swelled with invitations. They swelled with arguments. Women did not ask to be heard. They insisted. Alva noticed. At first it was subtle. A leaflet slipped into a book, a headline underlined in pencil, a pamphlet folded neatly on a silver tray. She began requesting volumes from England, The Subjection of Women, The Wrongs of Woman, Women and Economics. She circled sentences, wrote in the margins, paced through drawing rooms while her gloves creaked with tension, and slowly a realization set in. Her life, the palaces, the marriages, the guest lists, had been a kind of war. A war she had fought without knowing the name of the battlefield. She had never called herself oppressed. She had simply refused to be managed. By 1909, she was attending meetings. Not speaking. Not yet. She arrived in gloves, sat near the back, listened, watched, asked for more materials, wrote checks, quietly, and allowed Marble House to be used for lectures. The rooms that once glittered with diamonds and duchesses now filled with folding chairs and sharp-edged voices. The air was different. Ink, sweat, perfume, paper. Crystal chandeliers shimmered over women in shirtwaists and walking boots who cared more for pamphlets than pearls. Her name began to appear in the margins of suffrage reports, a donor, a host, a silent patron. No interviews, no rallies, but the right introductions, meeting rooms arranged, paper sourced, printers paid. The movement noticed, not just her money, but her force. She wasn't one of them, but she was becoming something they needed. That same year, silence cracked from across the Atlantic. Consuelo was writing again. Her marriage to the Duke had collapsed. There were rumors of absences, of separate rooms, of cold dinners and colder mistresses. Alva read the reports with no expression. Then one afternoon, a letter arrived. Not with apologies, not with demands, just a clipped article and a single underlined sentence. The Duchess is said to have taken to causes. Alva replied with a copy of Votes for Women. Margins underlined, folded neatly, no note. A month later, a postcard arrived. No greeting, just a line. You're right to underline the margins. They often say more than the page. It was not forgiveness, but it was something. By 1912, the old world had dimmed. Mrs. Astor was dead. The 400 had scattered like ash. Great houses stood dark more often than lit. The footmen were dismissed, the menus shorter. Even the scandals felt smaller. Alva received fewer letters, sent fewer invitations, and did not miss them. She had spent decades fighting for place, for power, for approval. Now she no longer waited for a summons. She could walk in. In 1913, she funded an entire printing run of suffrage materials, not as Mrs. Belmont, as Alva. Her name, once engraved on gold-rimmed menus, now appeared on flyers, press releases, meeting notes. She still wore black, still signed her letters with a flourish. But the rooms she entered were no longer decorative. They were strategic. She had once built Marble House to impress society. Now she opened its doors to dismantle it. She didn't march, not yet, but she stood closer to the front, asked different questions, wrote larger checks, paused longer before saying no. They said she hadn't suffered, and perhaps she hadn't, not in the way others had, but she had seen the limits of power and what it cost to keep it. She had ruled gilded rooms and buried her regrets in silk. Now, she was done performing. By the end of 1914, the words had begun to shift. Not Mrs. Belmont, but Mrs. Belmont, the suffragist. She had not transformed overnight. She had listened her way forward. In July 1914, Marble House did not echo with music. It thundered with voices, not a ball, a rally, not pearls, placards, not princes, printers. Alva stood where once she had received the Prince of Wales, now before women in linen dresses and wide-brimmed hats. She did not smile. "I have always had the satisfaction of knowing that I was never a puppet," she told them, "and I intend to be of some use now that I have learned what my life meant." The press swarmed. Society recoiled. But the movement took notice. That summer, she was elected president of the Political Equality Association of New York, and she aligned not with the careful moderates, but with Alice Paul, 30 years her junior and trained by the radicals of Britain. Alva gave more than her name. She gave funds. She gave fire. She paid for ink, for bail, for banners that read, "Votes for Women Now." She had once paid for palaces. Now she paid for bullhorns. But even inside the movement, she was not welcomed without friction. The old guard, Carrie Chapman Catt, Anna Howard Shaw, whispered behind her back that she was buying her way into history, that she had never suffered, that she had no right to speak of equality after reigning as a queen. The younger women admired her, but feared her dominance. Some saw a benefactor, others a threat. She hadn't come to join. She had come to lead, and they knew it. Her speeches sharpened. "The women of America have been trained to obey," she declared. "We are now training them to think." Reporters called her the Mrs. Belmont, half respectful, half mocking. She didn't flinch. She had been called worse, and by richer people. She refused to soften, refused to sit down, refused to let her wealth be treated as shame. Across the Atlantic, Consuelo watched from London. Her marriage had hollowed. The Duke had mistresses. The title was cold. She had separated quietly. No scandal, no press. She joined the Women's Suffrage Association in England, not as a duchess, but as a volunteer. She worked in silence. Then her mother's name appeared in a headline, "Mrs. Belmont's Marble House Rally." Society matron hosts suffragist by the sea. Consuelo clipped it, folded it into her diary. She didn't write. Alva saw the clipping months later, reprinted in the English press. No note, no comment, just the headline. They were now on the same side, but not in the same room. The silence between them had changed its shape. It no longer punished, it waited. Alva raised banners in public. Consuelo whispered support in private. The press printed them together, mother and daughter suffragists. But they never stood beside each other, not once. Alva had once chained her daughter to a title. She had once ruled from velvet chairs beneath gold ceilings. Now she stood beside placards held by women in boots. Now she dared to speak of liberation, not as penance, but as purpose. In 1915, the New York suffrage referendum failed. Alva did not cry. She funded another round of lectures. She doubled her printing budget. She widened her mailing lists. She took no press questions, but she signed every check with her own name. Her voice was not soft. It was structural. By the end of 1916, she was the largest single funder of militant suffrage in the United States. She had alienated old friends, lost favor with high society, and she had never felt more necessary. She was not yet marching, but she was arming the women who would. In January 1917, women in long coats and pinned hats stood outside the White House gates, holding silence like a weapon. They were the silent sentinels, the first women to ever protest a sitting American president. Their signs were simple. "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" They stood for hours, through sleet and rain, while tourists gawked and soldiers laughed. Alva Belmont paid for the signs. She paid for the buttons, the printing, the wagons, the sashes, the coal stoves used to warm the marchers' hands. She did not join the picket line, but she funded the women who did, and when the arrests began, she paid for bail, lawyers, ink, and telegrams. "It is not civil unrest," she wrote to one newspaper editor. "It is civil awakening." By spring of 1917, the women were no longer just standing, they were being dragged away. Police called it obstruction. A woman holding a sign outside the White House could now be arrested, jailed, and sent to the Occoquan workhouse, where the cells stank and the uniforms were stiff with rot. Alva paid their legal fees. She funded their appeals. She remained behind the scenes, gloved still, but resolute. When 25 women were arrested in one day, she wired $3,000 overnight to cover defense costs. When Lucy Burns was chained by her wrists to the bars and left all night, Alva wired 2 lawyers and a press team. When Alice Paul was placed in solitary confinement for 3 weeks and threatened with commitment to a mental asylum, Alva called her the most honorable prisoner of conscience in America. "These women are not dangerous," she told a reporter. "They are necessary." Then came November 14, 1917, later known as the Night of Terror. At Occoquan, 40 women were beaten, kicked, hurled into dark cells. Dora Lewis was knocked unconscious. Alice Kosu was denied medical treatment. Lucy Burns had her hands cuffed above her head and was left hanging for hours. Some began hunger strikes. They were force-fed through rubber tubes, strapped to chairs, choked on their own resistance. Alva did not blink. She did not weep or write condolences. She paid for lawyers. She paid for stenographers. She funded the publication of the Suffragist special issue detailing the brutality, complete with illustrations and quotes from inside the prison walls. "This," she wrote in the margins of her copy, "is what it took." In 1918, she bought a townhouse on Lafayette Square, just across from the White House, to serve as the official headquarters of the National Woman's Party. 3 floors, printing rooms, meeting halls. It became known as the house that Alva built. She gave $120,000 over 4 years, nearly $2 million in today's dollars. Her name was not etched into the plaque, but the women inside knew. "Mrs. Belmont," Alice Paul once said, "does not knock, she builds her own doors." Even now, the movement was fracturing. Many feared they were going too far. Carrie Chapman Catt begged Paul to halt the pickets during wartime. Others accused Alva of throwing money to rewrite her past. She did not respond. She'd once been excluded from society for wanting too much. Now she was excluded from the movement for giving too much. She had never been beloved. She had always been useful. Consuelo in England watched it all from newspapers. She was now giving speeches herself on girls' education, war relief, inheritance law. Her tone was soft, tempered. One article printed their names together, 2 generations for equality, the Duchess and the Radical. Consuelo wrote a letter. "You are very bold now." Alva replied, "I was always bold. I was only alone." They never spoke of the past again. In July 1919, a final march was planned. It would be the last before the amendment reached the Senate. Alva funded trains, paid for housing. She bought cloth for banners, white for purity, gold for power, purple for dignity. On the day of the march, 2,000 women walked down Pennsylvania Avenue. Alva, in black, walked at the back. She was not invited to lead. She was not handed a sign, but she was there. When the crowd turned toward the Capitol, she stopped in front of the White House, just briefly. She looked at the gates, the same gates where women had once been dragged by their collars. And then she turned and kept walking. She had once ruled ballrooms. Now she passed through silence. On August 18, 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified. On August 26, it was signed into law. Women could vote. It had taken 72 years. No one called Alva Belmont to speak. Her name was not listed on the commemorative documents. There were no medals, no roses, no titles. She issued one line to the press: "Let us not forget who tried to stop us." Then she returned to Belcourt. The victory was never gentle. It was never clean. It was paid for in bruises, arrests, silence, and checks signed in her name. But it held. And this time, there was no ceiling overhead. The banners were folded. The vote was won. When the amendment became law, she said simply, "We have begun. We are not finished." Then she went home. She had once built houses to be seen. Now she left quietly, her work already standing. There were no chandeliers overhead this time. Only sky. In the months that followed, others took the stage. Carrie Chapman Catt founded the League of Women Voters. Alice Paul turned toward the Equal Rights Amendment. The National Woman's Party moved on to labor laws and jury inclusion. Alva withdrew. She sold her townhouse. She stepped back from the board. She answered fewer letters, not out of bitterness, just completion. She began funding women's initiatives abroad, in South America, in France, in Mexico. She donated to printing presses, translation bureaus, boarding schools. She sent money with notes that read, "Use this for what they haven't built yet. Send me a copy. Make it last." She had spent her life asking to be received. Now she opened the door for others. The letter arrived in 1921. It was handwritten, folded once, no return address. Consuelo's signature at the bottom. "I hear you are in Paris. I would like to see you." There was no preamble, no wound reopened, just a possibility. Alva stared at it for nearly an hour. Then she wrote back, "There is a room, and it is open." By 1923, she had relocated to France, a small house in Saint-Brice-sous-Forêt, not far from where Consuelo now lived with her second husband, Jacques Balsan. "I lived in a house that was a fortress," she told a visitor once. "Now I want to live somewhere I can leave the windows open." Consuelo visited first, then again. Sometimes they sat in silence. Sometimes they walked through the garden. They did not speak of the Duke or the wedding or the weeping behind the veil, but they spoke. Consuelo brought books. Alva brought clippings. They read aloud. They argued. They made tea. They did not call it forgiveness, but it was closeness, and that was more useful. "You used to write in the margins," Consuelo said once. "I still do," Alva replied. "Only now, someone reads them." In 1925, Alva sold Marble House. There was no ceremony. She kept a few pieces, a mirrored screen, a single chair, a portrait of Consuelo at 18. The rest was gone. It had once been a fortress. Now it was just furniture. That winter, she hosted a group of students from the Sorbonne, all women. They sat in a tight circle around her parlor fire. The house smelled of old paper and lavender. Alva served weak tea in chipped cups. She did not rise. Her bones ached, but she spoke clearly. "You will be told you are late. You will be told the door is closed. You may need to build your own. I did. It is worth it." The youngest girl wrote it down. By 1928, Alva lived mostly in silence. She read the news, she answered letters, she kept her rooms warm and her windows open. Sometimes Consuelo would come for lunch. They'd sit beside each other, say very little, but when Consuelo left, Alva would pause by the door. Watch her walk down the drive, just for a moment. "She walks like she isn't afraid anymore," Alva once said. "That's the only thing I ever wanted." By 1928, Alva was slowing. The walks became shorter, the letters more dictated than written. Her doctors called it anemia. She called it inconvenient. "My body is quieter," she told a friend. "My mind has not agreed." She refused to be moved to a clinic. She stayed in her modest house in Saint-Brice, north of Paris. No chandeliers, no marble, just windows she liked to keep open and curtains that stayed pinned back. She still read 4 newspapers a day. She kept a notebook at her bedside, recording quotes, articles, lists of people she meant to support. In the final 5 years of her life, Alva funded a school for girls in Paris, paid the travel costs for 3 Latin American women to attend the Women's Rights Congress in Geneva, sponsored a series of translated feminist essays into Spanish, sent anonymous donations to suffrage initiatives in Egypt, Uruguay, and Haiti. She did not sign her name. They will not know who gave, but they will speak because someone did. Her letters grew shorter. To Alice Paul, she wrote, "You remain necessary." To a French activist, "Print more copies than you think you'll need." To Consuelo, she sent a single line, "You were never late. Only I was." Her bedroom was small, 1 desk, a worn armchair, no gold frames, no silk walls. The fire burned low. The books were stacked unevenly. On the wall, a photo of Consuelo, not posed, not titled, just laughing, hair loose, eyes nearly closed. She kept a drawer of small things, a suffrage ribbon, a campaign button that said, "Votes for Women," a newspaper clipping of the 1917 pickets, 1 folded note that simply said, "Thank you." No velvet, no invitations, no regrets. On January 26, 1933, Alva Belmont died in her sleep. She was 80 years old. No headlines followed. The American press called her a socialite, a divorcee, a builder of ballrooms. Few mentioned the women or the causes she funded or the laws she'd helped change. The doors she'd kicked open and left unguarded. Her funeral was small, no speeches, no swarming crowds, just a few women. And Consuelo. She left her estate not to society institutions, not to legacy trusts, but to women's colleges, legal aid societies, 3 international press funds, and her daughter. She built palaces, she tore down gates, and she died with the door open. Alva was not soft. She was not kind. She was, by every account, difficult, imperious, exacting, impossible to manage. She raised her daughter to obey, then fought for a world where no daughter would have to. She built houses so large they made the old families tremble, and then funded women who had no houses at all. She married for position, then divorced for heir. She was resented by those she gave to, feared by those she challenged, and understood by almost no one. But she opened the door, not once, not briefly, not symbolically. She opened it with money, with marble, with marches, with banners, with bruises she did not wear but paid for. And when victory came, she did not stand for applause. She stood at the back, in black, and watched the others walk through. She lived too long to be simple. She lived too fully to be forgiven. She did not beg to be loved. She demanded to be heard, and then made sure others could speak. When she was gone, there were no fireworks, no parades, just a room somewhere with the window open, and the faint sound of footsteps on a path she had paid for in full. Thank you for watching this week's video on Alva Vanderbilt. If you're curious to see how her daughter's story unfolded, be sure to watch our video on Consuelo Vanderbilt, the Duchess who learned to reclaim her voice. Now we want to hear from you. What's your opinion of Alva? Was she ruthless in her rise to the top, or simply playing the only game women were allowed to win? How do you feel about her relationship with Consuelo? Are her actions in any way forgivable? And what do you think caused her change later in life, when she stepped out of the spotlight and began quietly funding causes for women's rights and education? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. As a small channel dedicated to women's biographies, we'd love to hear your thoughts on who we should cover next. Your likes, comments, and support truly make a difference. The algorithm often favors quick, scandalous 15-minute stories, not deeper, more thoughtful narratives. So thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. And a heartfelt thank you to our patrons and subscribers, the mythic men and women who help keep this channel alive. You allow us to tell women's stories the way they were meant to be told, truthfully, without bias, and without judgment. Velocity Girl, Zen Life 68, Jillian Barker, Philip Gallegos, Kingsley Clark, Kafum Chung, Deborah Himes, Bhavya Andrea, Tracy Walsh, Joy McGuire, Amanda Lynn, Marianne Nelson, Deborah Shepard, Jules Mack, Maureen Tommen, Beth Dawson DDH, Kimberly Ray, Stephanie Warren Smith, Monica, Krista Schaefer Hazlett, Supreme, Joya, Steve Weinstein, Deborah Chmielewski, Anna Livy, Roxanne Schuster, Kathleen Martin, Morena Barron, Melissa Pouliot, Kelly Bowen, Gwen, Melissa Gilmore, Kelly Patwell, Marsha Corbin, Randy Fox, Lucy Gonzalez, Curious Traveler, Deb Fisher, Dreaming of the Kingdom, Sumari Henderson, Nikayla Rihanna, Sarah Bleiberg-Stanton, Will Kolb, Liz Karen, Maria Corrali, CTS Bathory, Snowball, Kendra McNally, Ida Kloster Jensen, Beth Dawson, Joanne Thomas Yakuto, Laura Lamond, Morena Barron, Real Steel Magnolia. Janet Phelps, Catherine Ratensky Harrison, Black Cat Tarot, Chrissy Bethune, Michael Nelson, Karen Craig, Catherine Davison, Murphy's Bed, Lynn Sharp, Michelle Griffin MacGregor, M. King, Virgie R. Nelson, Michelle Inman, Jamie Sue Kalamazoo, Susan Harris, Gus Gus the Cat, PB, Jen Kin, Michelle Lynn Neal, Michael Dean Augustin, Black Knight 5897, Wendy Fairfull, Trudy DeSwart, Susie Work, Deborah Britton Offer, Pitchick, Kate Lynch, Ram, Fiona McDougall, Julianne Scovern, Sashi, Amy Johnson, Patricia Maud, G. and Kathy Harris. And to all the silent men and women out there watching till the last note plays, thank you. All of you make this channel special. You are all the keepers of memory, and I appreciate being on this journey with you. Until next week, stay curious, stay strong, keep exploring history, and as always, thanks for watching Mythic Women.